Let me introduce
You're responsible for this.
Sean Greenberg and Bob Sleigh, who are going to be speaking on translating the Theodicy. It's a co-presentation. I don't know what order they're going to do it in. I'll just leave it to you.
Alphabetical.
Right, I'll begin. Despite the fact, that's a little loud, despite the fact that Leibniz himself, as we've just heard from Greg, wanted the Theodicy to be translated into English, it wasn't until 1951 that an English translation was published. We think that the edition that contains that translation, originally published by Yale in this country and Routledge and Kegan Paul in England, and published now by Open Court Publishing, which we will henceforth refer to as the Huggard edition, since the text was translated by E.M. Huggard, we think that this translation is itself at least in part responsible for the fact that the Theodicy has not received sustained attention as a work as a whole from English language commentators. Indeed, the Theodicy hasn't received the kind of sustained attention that certain of Leibniz's unpublished correspondences have, and that his only other unpublished book has received from my colleague Nick Jolly. While, to be sure, the Theodicy has not lacked for English language readers in the 300 years since it was published, and especially in recent years, it hasn't lacked for readers. To take an example with which Bob and I are very familiar, much recent work on Leibniz's views on human freedom makes very heavy weather indeed of passages from the Theodicy. And while the general importance of the Theodician project for Leibniz has, especially since the publication of Don Rutherford's Leibniz and the Rational Order of Nature, become, we think, something of a commonplace of Leibniz scholarship, English language scholars have yet to engage with the Theodicy as a work. We're hoping that this conference is a sign that that's going to begin to change. Now, I know that things are, of course, different on the continent, especially in France, especially because they don't have to work with translations. Thanks, of course, to the pioneering work of Gaston Grua and the more recent work of Paul Rateau. Now, we're, of course, well aware that the mere appearance of a new translation and edition of the Theodicy isn't going to change things overnight. In good Leibnizian fashion, though, we're going to take the long view, and we hope, by means of our editions and translation, to help bring it about that the Theodicy can finally be received as a work by English language scholars and students. To that end, we aim to produce two editions, a student edition and a scholarly edition of the work. Incidentally, Oxford University Press will be publishing both editions. The scholarly edition will appear in the context of a 3-volume edition of Leibniz's published works under the general editorship of Paul Lodge. While the editions will share a translation, about which more shortly, they'll differ with respect to apparatus and annotation, and we'll be discussing those differences today in due course. Before turning to our project, though, and discussing the principles of translation and the nature of the student and scholarly editions, we want to say a little bit about the Huggard edition. The Huggard edition is in many respects a strange little book. To begin with, Huggard is supposed to be a translation of Gerhardt's edition of the Theodicy, which is based on the first edition of that work, published, of course, anonymously. Since Gerhardt used the first edition of the Theodicy as his copy text, and by the by, for those of you who haven't been editing texts recently, a copy text is the one on which you take as the basis for your edition. Since Gerhardt used the first edition of the Theodicy as his copy text, the Causa Dei isn't presented in Gerhardt as part of the Theodicy, but rather as an independent work. It was published as a pamphlet. And Gerhardt even includes at G6 437, for those of you who have your Gerhardts with you, at G6 437 a facsimile of the title page of the Causa Dei. However, in Huggard, following the translation of the third appendix of the Theodicy on King's book on the origin of evil, one finds the following text underneath the heading Causa Dei asserta per justitiam eius cum caeteris eius perfectionibus cunctisque actionibus conciliatam. Quote, the original edition of the Theodicy contained a fourth appendix under this title. It presented in scholastic Latin a formal summary of the positive doctrine expressed by the French treatise. It satisfied the academic requirements of its day, but would not, presumably, be of interest to many modern readers, and is, consequently, omitted here. This is sort of weird. The original edition of the Theodicy, i.e. the first, i.e. the edition included in Gerhardt, didn't include the Causa Dei, which was only included in the second and subsequent editions. Given the fact that Huggard is supposed to be a translation of the first edition of the Theodicy, shouldn't have even mentioned the Causa Dei in that edition. So Huggard itself is therefore an odd kind of compendium of the first and later editions of the Theodicy, which doesn't make this clear to readers and is therefore itself problematic as an edition. It does state up front that it's supposed to be a rendering of Gerhardt, yet it renders something that isn't part of the Theodicy as presented by Gerhardt. Returning to the Causa Dei, that text, we think, is not meant merely to satisfy, quote, the academic requirements of its day. You know, which academic requirements was Leibniz supposed to be satisfying exactly? I mean, what academy? But leaving that aside, we think that the text is of considerable philosophical interest in its own right. And indeed, recent scholars interested in Leibniz's philosophical theology have made much of certain passages in this text. But it's not like recent scholars have only have discovered the Causa Dei. Paul Schrecker, whose translation of the Causa Dei remains the only available English translation of the text, explains that, quote, the Causa Dei summarizes in a rigorous and concise style the development of ideas in the great work, the Theodicy. The Theodicy is much more a highly popularized work than a methodical and formal exposition of the Leibnizian theology. That is why Leibniz, recognizing that the Theodicy was not a scientific work, aid and comfort to Paul Chateau here, recognizing that the Theodicy was not a scientific work, but only a web of thoughts expressed a bit colloquially, added to it a systematic abridgment in Latin directed more particularly to theologians and philosophers. 40 years of struggle for the union of the churches, divided above all on the very question discussed in this work, had matured the theology of Leibniz, which has found here an expression both lucid and permeated with wisdom. Okay, well, Schrecker may be going a little above board. Nevertheless, we agree with Schrecker that the Causa Dei summarizes in a rigorous and concise style the development of the ideas in the great work. Moreover, we think it illuminates those ideas. Consequently, our edition will include a translation of the Causa Dei, and that's why we're taking the second edition of the Theodicy as our copy text. Now, in addition to these problems as an edition, moreover, and just as importantly from our standpoint as translators, the translation included in Huggard is problematic, both infelicitous and with some frequency inaccurate. First, regarding the infelicity. Although Leibniz wasn't a native French speaker, and I guess you'd probably have to say, so he was a native German speaker, his Latin was probably better than his French, so French was his third language. I mean, he did get help. We learned from Maria Rosa Antonieza's biography. He did get some assistance on the French of the Theodicy. Although Leibniz wasn't a native French speaker, he wasn't incapable of writing very clear French prose. And we, well, here at least I'm going to have to say Bob and I go back and forth on this. I, at least, don't find the prose of the Theodicy that intolerable. People complain about it being a rambling, boring work. Leibniz doesn't know how to control himself. I think Leibniz knew very well why he was writing the way he was. He chose to write that way. Explaining why he might have made that choice, that's a matter for another day and not a discussion of principles of an edition and translation. But I think such a case can be made out. That said, so I don't find the prose of the Theodicy that intolerable. To be sure, it's not like Descartes' or Malebranche's French. But then again, Leibniz wasn't a native French speaker. In Huggard's hands, though, at least I find the prose of the Theodicy to be ponderously Baroque. Maybe that's what Huggard thought captured the spirit of Leibniz. I think if we knew more about the translator, Emmeline Huggard, we might be able to venture a hypothesis as to why we have the translation that we find in the Huggard edition. However, we've been able to find out remarkably little about Huggard, besides the fact that she translated several novels from German and a number of works, mostly on issues having to do with building and concrete, but also the report of an Antarctic expedition from Swedish. She has disappeared. So anyone with news about, or biographical information about Emmeline Huggard is kindly asked to report it on LeibnizText.com when it's up. Now, the inaccuracies of the translation have long been recognized. When Huggard first appeared, Paul Schrecker reviewed the work and noted various places where amendments are necessary. Certain of Schrecker's suggestions were incorporated in a translation of an abridged version of the Theodicy edited by Diogenes Allen and published by Bobbs Merrill in 1966, but now out of print. Given the significance of the Theodicy, it's crucial that a translation of the work not add to its difficulties for the reader. This is exactly, though, what Huggard does. We can do better. Finally, it should be noted that Huggard itself isn't exactly always a translation. So sometimes it's a bad translation, and sometimes it's not a translation at all. For the original published version of the Theodicy is primarily in French with a smattering of Latin, and I guess a little bit of Greek, too.
A little, yeah.
Yeah, and amazing as it may seem, Huggard translated the French into English and let the Latin stand. We'll translate both into English.
I'm glad you didn't mention the Greek.
Yeah, I just think there's a little bit, if I'm right. While the translator of the Theodicy is elusive, much more is known about Austin Farrer, who contributed the introduction to Huggard. A distinguished, albeit eccentric, Anglican biblical scholar and philosophical theologian, a Gifford lecturer on freedom of the will, his introduction, which Bob and I were shamefaced to admit to each other that we only read this summer. And now, come on, full disclosure, how many people here have read through the introduction to Huggard? Wow, one person. Okay.
Hire them.
Yeah, a member of Evil Camp. Isn't that great? Now, this introduction, while interesting in certain respects, is idiosyncratic, to say the least, and outdated. And more importantly, it's pretty useless to a first-time reader of the Theodicy, for it offers little by way of guidance to the work, and therefore doesn't really prepare the reader for what she will encounter in the body of the book. Huggard also offers little to the reader by way of editorial apparatus. No annotations, no explications of Leibniz's claims or references to his other works, and it also fails to include the index prepared by Leibniz, included in Gerhardt, published in the first edition of the Theodicy, which isn't a bad index, but, you know, it leaves a little bit to be desired as indices go. As Bob said, no doubt Leibniz had better things to do than to fuss over indices. And instead, it includes a lengthy, but we find generally unhelpful index nominum. Okay, so much for the deficiencies of Huggard. We think we can do better. We now turn to explaining how we propose to go about doing so. So I'm going to begin by talking about translation and then turn to the editions. Our overarching aim is to produce a translation that hews closely to the text and nevertheless is readable. As those of you in this room who've done some translation know, this is a difficult balancing act indeed. It's made less difficult for us by the fact that the Theodicy isn't written in rigore metaphysico, but was intended for a wide, popular, well, I guess as popular as you could get in an age when relatively few people could read, a popular audience. This gives us a little more room to play, but nevertheless, our chief aim is to stay as close to Leibniz's text as possible. Indeed, in preliminary drafts, I've even tried to follow Leibniz's sentence structure as closely as possible without producing barbaric English. In moments of insanity, I've fantasized about following the lead of Nabokov's grand, insane